Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. This is a show about how creatives use technology to tell their stories. And my guest today is Rich Chycki, a veteran mix engineer based in South Carolina, who has mixed rock legends such as Aerosmith, Alice Cooper, Dream Theater, Mick Jagger, and of course, progressive rock icons Rush. Rich's Dolby Atmos mixes of classic albums, moving pictures, and signals build on his original surround mixes, and with Dolby Atmos, Rich shares his approach to honoring creative intent and ensuring a compelling, immersive music experience that translates across playback systems at home and on the go. Rich shares how Dolby Atmos enables his mixes to highlight the sonic textures of Geddy Lee's signature voice and bass, Alec Lifeson's beautiful and complex guitar work, and the impeccable grooves of drummer Neil Peart. Plus, he shares his excitement for new and original music being created in Dolby Atmos from inception. Enjoy. I am so happy to welcome mix engineer Rich Chycki. Great to see you, Rich, and thank you so much for doing this. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Ben.
Absolutely. Pleasure's all mine. So you're in your studio now in South Carolina, but you spent some of your early career in Toronto and also Los Angeles, right? Where you were at the legendary Ocean Way studio. What were the early days in the industry like for you, and what brought you to South Carolina to build your studio there?
Well, I got started in the music industry as an artist, and I got started as an engineer strictly out of ignorance, because that's what I thought musicians did, that you had these ideas, these creative musical ideas, and you needed to capture them. So I thought you recorded them yourself. So I go back a fair ways. So I went to the days of getting, a 4-track, reel-to-reel 4-track, and a really modest setup, and learning how to record myself. And it was one of those things that the biggest thing about it was, strangely enough, the first thing that you record is, first thing I recorded was terrible, but it taught me project management and getting stuff done, which is kind of an unspoken skill that really, from a sonic point of view, isn't relative, but it is from, being able to interact within a fairly high-paced industry. And this is pre-internet, and it was really, a lot of it was word of mouth, and working in a little facility and a lot of traffic where musicians had come through. I worked in a rehearsal place that had a studio built into it, and musicians would poke their head in and say, "Hey, what are you doing?" "Oh man, we need something recorded." And then you have all these bands that are sending stuff to record companies to try and get the unicorn, the perfect record deal, right? And, record companies would say, "Well, who recorded this?" And all of a sudden I would get labels that were starting to call, and they said, "Listen, we've got some bands that we're developing, and do you want to cut?" And they were songwriting demos and stuff. And then all of a sudden it's like, "Hey, you know what? We could keep these, And then so suddenly my work was starting to be released, and I was still trying to get a record deal at the time. And, I started to work with larger and larger artists, and I worked with this guitar player named Jeff Healey. He was this guitarist that had done really well. He'd starred in a Patrick Swayze movie, a Roadhouse, and I ended up recording a record for him. And I met a producer named Marty Fredrickson, and Marty was he was this up and coming songwriter and musician extraordinaire, and he was working with a bunch of artists, and Healy had hired him to produce some songs, and Marty and I got along great. And I was into all these things, saying I want to mix into a computer when, it was heresy. People would be like, "You can't do that. You can't record on a hard disk. You need tape." And we got along because, it was, I had all these really cutting edge ideas, and he loved that. I was editing drums in Pro Tools, and he loved that because that was still a fresh thing. And he called me, maybe 3 months after, 3-4 months after I was finished working with him with Jeff Healey, and he offered me a gig working with Aerosmith. And that was kind of the dividing line in my career, where, anything about me trying to get a record deal, it's like, it was so busy. The Aerosmith record I did came out, I think, number 2 on Billboard. #1 at rock radio Billboard. And it's just, since then, it was like, and, ended up going to LA, moved to LA for a bit to do some work there, and went back to Toronto, and now I'm in South Carolina. Mostly the main reason of it was for family reasons. And this is really, the community I'm in is really family oriented, and the weather's a lot better. And, I have my own facility where I do a lot of the work I'm doing is Atmos. So thank you for that, for the new format. And a lot of the work I'm doing is Atmos, and everything's fantastic.
Well, it's a beautiful area of the country, and thank you for what you're doing. We make the technology. It's folks like you that provide the art and, have these beautiful facilities to implement the technology into. You've got a pretty deep background actually in immersive and surround mixing, right? Take us through your Atmos implementation and kind of how you landed on what you wanted to install in your studio there, kind of going through the 5.1 and surround days.
Okay, the 5.1, I was doing, when I was in LA, I was still really into stereo. And of course, in LA, there's, I had a lot of ties in the movie community. And I had some buddies of mine saying, hey, you know what? There's some people here, they're starting to mix the music in 5.1, which would, at that time was just regarded as it was a film format. Right. And it was, he said, you should try this. And so I started to get into it very early on and start to experiment. And that concept of how to get audio so it was as bulletproof as possible across as many systems as possible, that it's different than doing a movie, and the adaptation of the technology, and to get it so that it could proliferate and, put it into cars, with cars an ideal situation to listen to immersive audio, because of the number of speakers that have always been in cars. Once they started to, a lot of there's just subgroups of stereo speakers in cars. And when you adapt it to immersive audio, the experience was really great, right? And a lot of people spend time in cars. So it was one of those things that turned out to be a handy format. So I started very early on in 5.1, and I mixed like tons of Rush in 5.1, again, being progressive rock, that the format really was ideal for a band of that ilk to be able to have that combination of a band with a fantastic track record, and then adapting their music to the new technology of 5.1. So I ended up doing tons of stuff for that, a lot of catalog. We did all the live music was in 5.1 since I know that they did. I came on at R30 from there forward. That would have been in 2005. 2005. I started with them in 2004 doing some stereo stuff. So 2005 was the first 5.1. And then from then on, all of they did Rush and Rio was done in 5.1, but I did 5.1 for them moving forward to today. And that turned out to be a great format. And then again, I had some buddies of mine in the movie industry who were saying, Dolby is doing this thing, that in Atmos, and it addressed the issues of being more accommodating to a lot of different types of listening systems. So it was a much more robust system. And then the whole concept of, and the word is used to death these days, but the whole concept of immersive, of kind of losing the idea that you have two speakers, they're there and you're listening to them, you kind of lose yourself, and you have music coming at you physically from all different sides. We could fake that in 5.1, or we could fake it in stereo using phase and delays. But, that physicality of it, the literal sense of something coming at you from a different direction, is, from a human listening point of view, is a lot easier to digest. We digest the directionality of it easier than having to, use the cause effect or some other thing to adapt to say, oh, the music's coming from up there, to imagine it as opposed to it really being there. So I started to get into doing music, and I was starting to I would recycle. At the very beginning, I was recycling some 5.1 mixes and reformatting them into immersive audio to get feedback from clients. And overall, generally speaking, I'd be dealing with the artist as opposed to label. So it's kind of artist first and then label would get on board. And 100% all artists were so blown away by hearing their music in the format that, you know, I knew it was going to be a thing. I knew it was going to take off because so many artists were overwhelmed by the experience of listening in Atmos that this was more of a business sense, is that, okay, if all of the bean counters can make this work, this is going to be huge, because from a creative standpoint and a delivery standpoint, it was next level.
Yeah, so take us a little into kind of the creation and the delivery process. I mean, it's really about, you say artistic and artistic intent. It's really about honoring the creative intent of these original mixes, which you took very careful work to do with the 5.1 mixes. And now, with the accessibility of the Atmos technology, you have even more opportunity to kind of go back and uncover what was originally recorded and breathe some new life into it. And in particular, these mixes, anything by Rutch, which is just, like such part of the fabric of rock music history, right? And like universally adored. Of course, you have to note that the musicianship and the songwriting is just absolutely phenomenal, right? And it's recorded so well. So you're going back to these multi-track tapes, right? And sort of recreating what you would need for an immersive mix or an Atmos mix. So take us a little bit into that kind of prep process and, how you're discovering what was on these tapes and how you sort of lay the sessions out as you get going.
There are two different approaches. If I'm working with an artist, an artist that is, they're releasing their project, they're doing a first record, a second record, and they want to say, you know what, we're going to do it in Atmos at the same time. And let's say it's a young artist or a fresh artist. That approach in immersive audio is distinctly different than what you just brought up, which is catalog, and there's an existing mix, and it's a mix that has long lineage and a track record that there is no option to reinvent the wheel, right? Where the name of the game is to take the project, and with a band like Rush, say Moving Pictures is a good example. That's 44 years old. Here we are working with a bunch of systems that'll do 192K, 32-bit. That's a lot of fidelity that didn't exist back then. The Rush masters that we all know and love are 44.056 12-bit masters. The whole record. That's what the record is, and that there is a respectfulness to say, okay, I have all of this equipment that can really make these delays that are exact clones of the asset that's being put into it, but old delays weren't like that. They were dirty, dark delays, more or less, compared to what we're using now. And same thing with reverbs, 10-bit reverb units that are that are grainy by comparison to what we have now. And it's the idea of listening to what existed and reproducing that and learning how to adapt today's hyper fidelity so that it matches what existed then. I talked to Terry Brown at length. I talked to Paul Northfield at length. That was the production team from the era, which was a bonus. And then knowing what was done at the studio, they had a SSL of 4000B and what the characteristics are of a console like that, and to keep things, like Neil Peart, his drum kit is his kit. We're not going to lay down kick and snare samples and, make it all, we're not going to Nickelback it, right? We're not going to make it, because it would be wrong for what it is, and so that gives a very distinct workflow that there's always that reviewing to, we're not going to give Geddy Lee the super subsonic bass that, we could give it, but that's not what existed on the original record. And, there's that concept of paying attention. The artist says, hey, I don't want my lead vocal or my whatever instrument, I don't want that cranking through the center speaker by itself. And if the artist doesn't want that, well, that's the way it is, regardless of, what the format's capability is. If we look at Atmos or 5.1, that, the center speaker is always, well, that was the dialogue track. So let's put the vocal in there by itself. And, if the artist doesn't want that, or there's a compromise, to put core elements in the center speaker, a bit of that, then that's the direction to go, so that it keeps the project faithful to the original, but offers a more modern and interesting experience based on the newer technology.
Yeah. So you mentioned, careful use of the center channel, for example. What is your take on using the center channel and taking it one step further, raising it a level, if you will? How do you approach using the space that's available in a Dolby Atmos environment when it comes to like height channels, for example? Are you tending to use a lot of separation, or do you and also like to use some movement as well? Because there's definitely some interesting use of all of those things in these mixes.
I've always opted for the concept of how is this mix going to survive in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And I think that there is a approach of prudence that if I want to make sure that the mix in 5 years, people don't go, oh, there's that. There's that trendy thing. I don't want my mixes to be the 80s gated reverb. Do you know what I mean? It's like everyone used to do that. Nobody does that anymore. You can't, because it'll sound like 80s. Do you know what I mean? Like if you use that nowadays, as soon as you put that on, people say, oh my God, that's 80s reverb. It's pegged. And I try to avoid that concept from a mixing point of view, where it's like, you know what? In 5 years, I want this mix to survive the maturing of the format, right? So as far as center speaker, I've never been a fan of putting either nothing or just putting the vocal in. For me, either one of those doesn't take advantage of the system as much as it could. I have a tendency to put what I call core elements in the center speaker, some core elements. So I rely on a phantom left and right, as well as some core elements added into the center speaker. So that would be core elements. I mean, sort of the mono things that we typically put in a mix: kick, snare, bass, vocal, right? So guitar solos and features that if I really wanted to stab out. So if you were to solo out one of my mixes, generally you would listen to it, you'd say, oh, that's kind of like it sounds like a bed track with vocal up in it. So the vocal is louder, but it's not alone, right? And there are some effects that are in there, as far as if there's an immersive reverb, you'll hear some of that coming through there as well. And I also use that for heights. I'm one of the ones that subscribes to the majority of the song structure is in the bed. 7.1.2 bed. Of course, there's no rules with how we do this, but that's my preferred way of doing that. And then as far as objects go, I use objects for features, for ambiances, and for any little pieces that I want to poke through that take advantage of the extra speakers in the upper speaker arrays.
The results speak for themselves, and there's so much cool to work with a band like Rush, right? I mean, you mentioned Moving Pictures, and I have to ask about the great opening song on the record, Tom Sawyer, right? One of the greatest rock songs of all time, certainly one of the greatest drum songs of all time. Such amazing playing, as always, by Neil Peart. one of the greatest drummers, arguably ever. I think most people would agree with that. Also, Alex's playing and his solo are so cool. And there's some cool synth work in there that's slowly kind of panning from right to left and back again. It's just a vibe, right? But share a little bit on your approach to treating the drums on this one, first and foremost. And, this was an early Dolby Atmos mix that a lot of people heard early on and really, really respected. And so, take us into a little bit how you specifically treated the drums, and then maybe a little bit about Alex's playing and his solo.
So for drums, with any of the catalog material, because there were no stems at that time. So the first thing that I have to do is I recreate the mix in stereo. First thing is to recreate the mix in stereo. And that gives me the effects bandwidths that we talked about, the selection of effects, the EQ of everything, the placement of everything in the stereo field. And then what I end up doing is when I solo out and I start to listen to the kit and the emotion of the kit, how it feels, and then it goes into the Atmos sound field, right? And the whole time, what I end up doing is, because the effects are at the time that I regenerate the effects, I'll use my plugin choices. I select those knowing that I'm going to go into a multi-channel format as opposed to stereo. So I will use, in that case, what I ended up doing for moving pictures is I used 8 versions of a Universal Audio Lexicon plugin. I used 8 to recreate an Atmos version of what I was looking for. So I had a separate unit, a separate UA card that was doing that on its own, but it was the same settings as what I had used in the original stereo remix, right? And then the same thing happens with delays, the placement of the delays, where, say with Geddy, there's there's some widening that's going on using harmonizing pitch changing technology, and the placement of that there's one type in the front speakers, one type in the rear, right? And when it comes to Atmos, there was additional ones that were put in subtly in the upper speakers. As far as getting back to Neil's kit for a second, one of the things that I do is I place the drums. The great thing is Neil's kits are typically very large, so there's more than a pair of overheads. So that gives us more. Well, that gives us more real estate to place microphones, right, widely, right. So we can use that to advantage. And what I have a tendency to do is I high pass all those microphones really radically, like 4 and 5K, and then I add just a bit of that higher up in the upper canopy of speakers. So you get the sizzle that's very, very high up, right? So there's that separation that you get. The cymbals do have like their body to them, right? But when I just remove all the body and just add a bit of sizzle up top, and things like toms, rather than toms being at height 0, right? The toms are raised up, right? So really it's like kind of, if you're standing in front of the kit, what I end up doing is I use a slight amount of height to emulate the height of the kit. When Neil is playing, you get the thud of the kick drum and snare. You have this great core feeling, but when he does his fills, there's that wraparound effect that he does, and it's subtle, but it's one of those things that in the immersive audio world, when you add all these little subtle things, that really is what makes the reality of the mix. That is what makes it immersive, that you could feel there's this motion where it's one instrument, but the instrument's it's not shaped like an ellipse like we have in stereo. It's shaped more, right? It's more like this, almost like a giant visor in front of you, right? Because it's more wraparound and it's taller, right? And that's something that gives, when Neil does what Neil does, that just gives that much more push to the performance, right? Because it's like you really feel it because you're right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it translates so well to an automobile. It translates so well to a studio environment. It translates so well to, a consumer system like a Sonos. I've listened to it many times on a Sonos system, and it's really quite phenomenal. Can you share a little bit about the experience that you told me about when I saw you at NAMM of Alex's approval process for listening to Tom Sawyer? Of course, Alex Lifeson, the great guitar player.
Al is he is the key man for Rush to approve mixes for re-releases, for live. When we had recorded albums, the whole band was there and they would be around for the mix process. But generally for re-releases, it's Al that flies the ship for that. And I got a call very early on because Amazon was deciding to take on immersive audio, and they wanted to do a special release with Limelight and with Tom Sawyer. And this is pre the album being done. This was kind of the concept of whether the band was going to move ahead and adopt the format. And I have a really great working relationship with Ged and Al and with Neil. And, it was like, hey, man, do what you do, and I'll come and check it out. So I did mix, and I gave him a call and said, listen, we'll be ready by whatever time. He said, okay, I'll come and check it out. So mix was completed, and, I just cleared out of the listening space and let him have a listen. And, he was grooving out, and then, he became, once it started to get toward the end, like kind of after the huge wraparound air drum solo that every drummer on the planet plays through, he became very still. And, I started to go, I wonder if he likes it. Right. And so because he was like completely still. And, got to the end where there's the piece at the very end where it's 7/4, right? It goes into the fade out. Fade out finishes, and he doesn't move a muscle. And I'm figuring, I'm dead. We're all dead. Thanks, Ben. No Atmos today. That's I thought, and he was still for, I don't know, it felt like a very, very long time. And he turned around and he just went, and he didn't say anything. And he just said, I've been playing this song for so long, and this is the first time I've ever heard through speakers what I've heard in my head. And that was, he was speechless. He was speechless. And it was one of those things that, when you see an artist with that amount of lineage, that amount of history, and when he responds to his own music that powerfully, then it's a winning format, because any artist that I've done an example for their music has reacted in a very similar way. But he was kind of the first that reacted that way, and it was so satisfying to see the artist fell back in love with what they did. That's a big honor to be able to provide that. And that's something that I have to thank, you and Dolby for, because it's a format that does that. And, you had mentioned that you listen to the music on different systems and it survives that. And the robust character of the mix is, every mix, when you change from system to system, whether it's a mono mix, it's always changing, right? And there's that idea of it changing and collapsing, right? We can listen to, we listen when we're mixing, we listen to the little Oratone speakers and all sorts of things that we want to make sure the vocal, it translates. We use translate, and that's the biggest thing, is that the mixes translate from system to system, and it's great.
Thanks for sharing that. That is a really special moment. I can only imagine how special and exciting that must have been to experience together with him. I have to ask about a couple of other tracks. Let's move on
Sure.
to the song Subdivisions, which of course is the first song from Rush's 82 album, Signals. Such a great groove as always, such great vocal harmonies from Geddy as always. I'm curious how you tend to treat the lead vocal, but also the harmonies and the layers that the band just is so well known for. What an amazing, unique voice he has. And when the harmonies come in and it's layered, it's just a really special and unique. And again, it's a vibe. It must be a pleasure to work with those tracks.
The bands change sonically from that previous record to Signals. Moving Pictures was very definite, and a lot more keyboards, a lot more keyboards on Signals. The great thing is, from a mixing point of view, my work really didn't change because I had to adapt my original stereo mix. My approach in the stereo mix changed because there was, Ged's voice became a little more processed, way more keyboards. The guitar, the positioning of the guitar changed from Moving Pictures to Signals, taking a little bit more of a conservative approach sonically to make space for the influx of keyboard technology. But that was all done for me in the stereo mix, so I'd already done the adapting there, right? So again, with the placement, if you listen, say, to another song on the record, Analog Kid, when you listen to that, that's a song that is there's counterpoint between, there's a lot of guitar going on in the verses. It's three-piece, guitar, bass, drums, and if you look at the head image that's in the Dolby renderer, there are no objects, zero objects, right? And when the chorus is hit, there's all these keyboards and bass Taurus pedals, and the sound of it, there's this big change in it sonically. Then that's reflected in my use of objects, where there's, the screen lights up with objects everywhere, and there's a lot of delays that go from the front to the rear speakers, for Ged's voice, and there's a lot of ambience that's moving around. But then when it goes back to the verse, it dries up and it gets very heavy, three-piece, and all the objects disappear. With a song like Subdivisions is one that's more, the approach is more single-like, where it's like there's a soundscape the changes in the soundscape is a little less radical, a little more static to reflect the radio nature of the song. But a song like Analog Kid, where there's this swaying of the sound image, then that's where I use the Atmos technology to great advantage to create to enhance like the change that the band was doing.
Well, the final song on Signals is also pretty special in Dolby Atmos as well, Countdown, where the band had recorded captured some radio transmissions, right, and sounds from, I think it was a Columbia Space Shuttle launch. Hearing that in the room at NAMM was really pretty phenomenal and special. It's also incredible to hear it on headphones, on a home theater system, in an automobile, wherever. Take us a little bit into how you created the Atmos mixes of that. And there's the sound of the jet, sort of like, or it's the shuttle, right? Like at the beginning, sort of streaming through the soundscape, the sound field there. How did you approach that one? And the results were really fantastic.
The great thing about Countdown is one of the closest iterations of a movie, right? So we had talked previously about adapting an immersive format to music, but with all of the sound effects in that song, all of the sound effects were really positioned like a movie, where the jet flyby comes in, I can't remember, I think it's rear left, and it comes around front, and and it disappears out the opposite side out front, and helicopters are flying by, and they're overhead, and tons of subwoofers, so that there is a lot of body to the sound, where it was that was added in, right? I added in a lot of subwoofer energy, and to really get us so that when you have a jet fly overhead, you can feel it. And I wanted to make sure when that very first plane goes over that it really shakes the place, right? And that was something that really sets up the format for the song, and including all of the there was a lot of radio tower satellite transmissions. I'm sorry, and a lot of those were a little hard to discern what was being said in the original mixes because you only have so much space in a stereo field, and I deliberately placed those in individual speakers in the upper canopy speakers so that you could really make out what was being said. And that's something that is it's a bit of a departure from the original mix, but it's something that, I think if it was something that was possible to do without compromising the music, that it would have been done at that time. But here we have that, what we had talked about. We have the separation using the physical nature of the format, and to be able to get it so that, all of the sound effects can pop without compromising the quality of the music.
You talked about this a little bit earlier, but there are some differences in working, right? When going into mixing a legacy project versus something that's brand new, or that you're even involved with the writing or recording process from the beginning. So, touch on some of the differences in your mind in kind of those two approaches to projects, sort of legacy versus something brand new.
That's a great question, because the approach from because of the way Atmos is, because of how we mix in Atmos, that there's two separate structures that we combine in Atmos. We have the bed, the 7.1.2 bed, and then we have objects. And objects are, they're never truly part of a mix. They're sitting within the 128 channel wave container, and they're layered with metadata so that the speakers know where to place things. So really what we're doing in Atmos technology is we're listening to a bed, which is a mix, and then we're listening to all these objects that are layered on top. So in a lot of ways, we're listening to a mix that's always in progress, right? It's always in progress, kind of like if somebody were to come in a room and listen to a song I haven't printed yet, right? It's mixed, but it's not finished yet. It's there live, and we're listening to it live. And that, to get it seamless, like for me in stereo, I'm a top-down mixer. And by that, I mean, I have a tendency to set up what processing I have on my stereo bus fairly early. And that might be EQ. It could be various levels of compression, depending on whether I'm working with a legacy band or a modern band, or I'm mixing a band that went through the loudness wars, and we need to maintain that mix, right? So there's all sorts of things that I might be doing to that stereo mix that if I do that to just the bed, then all of a sudden the objects become untreated, and the blend of objects relative to the bed might be unstable. So for me, it's been a learning process of how to process individual tracks and the bed so that I'm not relying on top-down mixing it as much. So there's actually a relearning process for somebody that mixes for somebody that doesn't use top-down mixing approach. It's probably less of an issue. But for me, there is a learning process of how to recreate things that I'd been doing for decades and have it so it was seamless, and it was it would yield the similar effect to the listener. When I'm working with a new artist, I'm working with an artist right now that they had immersive audio in mind when they wrote and tracked their record. And, the drums were recorded in an immersive fashion. When I recorded, I did two studio records with Rush, and I recorded Neil's kit with all the ambiances and the overheads were done in an immersive fashion. Not surrounding the kit per se, but in my case, because I prefer to have that feel of being in front of the drums, I had a canopy of drum mics for Neil, and then I had mics that were behind me as a listener and standing in front of the kit, so that I would be able to recreate that and say, okay, I'm going to put these microphones in these speakers behind me. I'm going to put these in front. And so you really had a literal placement of being in front of Neil while he's playing, right? That would have been for like Clockwork Angels and Snakes and Arrows. So that is something, that's an example of what I would do because I was anticipating doing something in immersive audio. This other artist had, it's heavily synthesizer based. So there were a lot of effects that he's put in where he has, okay, I've got these little sound effects that I'm doing, and I want these to be in the upper canopy. So, he would have his sound choices and decisions were based on the Z-axis placement, the vertical placement of where these sounds were going to go. And so when I would be getting notes, it would be just, for mixes, he's saying like, okay, this is upper, this is upper, this is this is that. And I had a placement expectations of where these sounds were supposed to go. And that's a radical departure because the stereo mix ended up being an output of what the immersive mix was, right? So in a legacy mix or catalog mix, we recreate the stereo mix and then we generate an immersive mix from that. In this particular case, we generate the immersive audio, right? And then go back and forth and listen to the re-renders of 5.1 and of stereo to make sure that the stereo is a representation of what the artist intends. So really they're signing off on multiple formats at the same time, right? Whereas that doesn't exist going for legacy.
And that later workflow certainly provides you much more flexibility, higher resolution assets to start with, and the ability to have the artist in thinking immersively from the beginning is probably really inspiring in many ways to them. There's really no limits to what they could do. So you're also educating people on what's possible using this technology. You're certainly also involved with inspiring the next generation of music creators and engineers out there in the world. Talk a little bit about the educational efforts that you're involved in and how you're kind of bringing all of your experience to the forefront to inspire creators of the future.
Well, I appreciate that. One of the things about a technology like Atmos is it gives producers, mixers, engineers, and artists, it gives us a new way to express, right? To creatively express. For me, a lot of the work I do is mixing. I do some production. I do some recording as well. But these days, a lot of the work I do is in mixing. And for me, it's rather than trying to reinvent ways of trying to cram bigger and bigger sessions into two speakers, I now have a lot more real estate to work with, and that's gratifying, and it gives me a lot of new creative energy. One of the things about and it's kind of a natural byproduct is that as you add speakers, it becomes things like speaker alignment and speaker placement and having your system aligned properly. It becomes exponentially more critical the more speakers you add in order for your work to translate. Your system has to be aligned even in stereo, but it becomes more critical. There was a big jump to 5.1 and there's an even bigger jump to Atmos, and it's important that your system is aligned so that we're all working on the same page and the playback specs match the playback specs of the consumer systems, match the specs of what we're doing, and there's that nice simpatico that everything plays nicely together. What I like to do is I like to educate people because it's, first off, I can give back to the community that's given me so much. It's given me this amazing career. And as well, when we have the education and we have tools and we have the education on how to use the tools, that perpetuates the format as opposed to destroy it. Because if if as mixers, if we can't get a grip on the format, right, there'll be this sucks. I'm just going to go back to my MP3s because those things at least sounded the same all the time. Or do you know what I mean? Like, we don't get a positive reaction consistently, right? And that's one of the things that I want to teach. That Atmos, that a musician should be a musician and create. That you shouldn't be a technician. It's like, you should be putting on a guitar, not a lab coat. And figuring out, how do I get Dante to work with the, it's something that, there are a lot of systems you hook up these days. You can hook up your DAW, you hook up your speakers, your level control, and boom, you're making music. And Atmos is getting closer to that. With every iteration, is getting closer to that, and that's fantastic. And what I want to do is, I like to speak to concepts of. I don't want to tell people how to mix in Atmos because that's creative. That's the creative latitude that a mixer has. But I do want to express that there are certain things that work for me that translate well from system to system. These are what they are. This is how it works. This is how I did it. And what do you think? And a lot of times it's like, oh, I never thought of that. Or somebody might say, I'm already doing that. Or I also get people that say, yeah, but here's what I do. And there's this sharing of information within the community that I think is really fantastic. And it's one of those things that having that community and having the Dolby Institute, and I'm setting up some master classes at a location to be determined, that I want people to listen and absorb and to learn and to network and to interact, and then take that knowledge and apply it to the project that they're working on, because there's so much different kinds of music that there's Atmos gives you almost an endless level of creativity, right? And there are no rules, and the only thing I can present are, here's rules that have worked for me. Here's stuff I've done that hasn't worked for me, and share that and share it to the next generation of mixers and engineers, and say, this is the way things are changing, and I'm adapting. I've been mixing forever. I'm an old guy. You're a young guy. Here, let's share info and keep the format going for the next generation of creative people.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and share your experiences with us, and just really appreciate all the great work you have done and will continue to do, Rich.
I appreciate it, Ben, and thank you. Thank you for your enthusiasm, and I can't thank Dolby enough for the great formats. It's one of those things that it's gratifying to, this is probably the biggest change since stereo, right? This is the biggest change since stereo, and that says a lot, because stereo is a really old format. So congratulations.
Huge thanks to Rich for joining me to share his stories of working with Rush, truly one of the most innovative and musically gifted bands of all time. And so cool to hear how Rich takes this music to all new heights and honors creative intent with his Dolby Atmos mixes. You can hear Rich's Dolby Atmos mixes of Rush's classic albums, Moving Pictures and Signals, on Dolby Atmos enabled streaming music services. And you can learn more about Rich at richardchycki.ca. That's Richard, CHYCKI.ca. To hear more conversations with mix and mastering engineers and producers working in Dolby Atmos, be sure you're subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube and our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about Dolby Institute, head over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs, subscribe to our mailing list, and you can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast. Dolby Institute is also where you'll find the Dolby Atmos Essentials course, covering all the topics you need to get started creating content in Dolby Atmos, from studio setup through QC and delivery. The training is delivered through text, graphics, and short videos Dolby Atmos core concepts are covered, including components of a Dolby Atmos studio. Various workflows are covered with specific training on using the Dolby Atmos renderer and a range of DAWs. Post-production and Atmos music focus exercises are included, along with demo and exercise content. It's completely free and available in 5 languages, so check that out. Professional.dolby.com is where you'll also find free trial downloads of the Dolby Atmos renderer and Dolby Atmos album assembler, as well as tutorial and quick start videos for both of those, plus links to the Dolby Atmos music knowledge base, forum, and FAQs where you can ask questions and interact with Dolby community and support teams. A directory of enabled music studios and studio best practices is there as well. Check out our Dolby Music Community Sessions homepage and YouTube channel for our monthly deep dive sessions with mix and mastering engineers, manufacturers, and installers covering studio setup and best practices. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon, and our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining.